Of all the cameras in the Fuji lineup today, I believe the X-T20, the X-T2, and the X-H1 are particularly great value on the used market. To understand why, let's dive into the specs and compare these cameras. As always, it's best to divide and conquer the system into three groups of cameras. First, we have the fixed lens cameras. You can't change the lens, you're stuck with whatever lens is bolted on the camera. Exemplified here by the X100 series, which has been a smashing success for Fuji. Next up, we have the rangefinder style of cameras. Again, these are not rangefinders, they're just styled to be this way. And we have the X Pro lineup pictured here with its clever hybrid viewfinder design where you can easily switch between optical and electronic viewfinders. And finally, the SLR style of cameras. You can see the difference between this one and the other two groups of cameras. Here we have the characteristic viewfinder hump in the middle of the camera. And there are many camera models under each of these groups, which is why we have to tackle them individually. Otherwise, there's just too much to compare. Now, you'll have to decide which style of camera is right for you. And the best way to do that is to see them, hold them in person, and then make a decision. Because it's one thing to compare specs on a screen. It's a whole different matter when you actually pick them up in your hand. You'll be able to quickly tell which lineup of cameras is right for you. Let's start with the fixed lens cameras. There's going to be a lot of data on the screen, so I'm going to explain what all the columns mean individually, and then we'll look at the cameras one by one. First of all, we've got the XF1 here, just as an example. It was released in 2012. It was 12 megapixels. It weighed 255 grams, very lightweight. The sensor type, the equivalent field of view in full frame 35mm terms. The aperture range, whether it has a viewfinder, whether it has image stabilization, the CIPA rated battery life, the maximum FPS or 7 frames per second, in this case, continuous shooting, how many autofocus points it has, whether the autofocus is CD, contrast detect, PD, phase detect, or both, whether the camera is stated as being weather resistant, whether the LCD is fixed, the LCD resolution, the maximum video specification, in this case 1080p 30 FPS, whether the camera has a microphone port, and whether it's still available new, and the latest price in US dollars on eBay. So going down the list, we have the XQ1, XQ2, XS1. You can see these are all using the smaller 2/3 sensor size, and these are all cameras with zoom lenses. The XS1 actually adds an EVF, an electronic viewfinder, albeit with a low resolution. The X10 marks the beginning of a line. We have the X20, X30, X70. Now you can see with the X70 and the XF10, the lens has now become a fixed focal length with an equivalent field of view of 28mm. Now with the X100, we get into the 35mm equivalent field of view. The X100 was a resounding success, so Fuji continued and followed up with the X100S or X100 second and X100T or X100 third. You can see where this is going. Then we have the X100F, and the last camera is still available new for $1,400, although it's been out of stock. Now you'll see that I've highlighted in yellow the X100T. That's the one I would personally go for if I was looking for a great value used camera with that 35mm equivalent field of view. You can see just based on the specs, the addition of phase detect autofocus is not to be underestimated, because with that comes much better autofocus speed and accuracy. This camera also adds face detection. It's overall faster and snappier in operation compared to the X100S, and it includes Wi-Fi and USB charging, not to mention the higher resolution LCD screen. You can see these two cameras side by side, the X100S and X100T. Looking at the top of the cameras, you can see the overall design aesthetic is very similar. Both of these cameras have a fixed screen. These are both great cameras. I'd be happy to shoot with either one. We divide the rangefinder style of cameras into three groups. The XA lineup is more entry level. They use a Bayer sensor, so not an X-trans sensor, which Fuji's known for these days, and they have no viewfinder, so you can pose with the LCD screen. The XE lineup is that mid-range. They've added an electronic viewfinder, which is very helpful, especially if you're taking pictures in bright, sunny conditions and it's hard to tell what's going on the LCD screen. And the X Pro cameras, culminating in the X Pro 3, are definitely the higher end cameras in this section. So once again, we're going to compare the specs of all these cameras. Starting with the XM1, which stands alone, never got an update. We have the XA1, XA2, XA3, 5, 7, 10. We have the XE1, XE2, XE2S, XE3, XE4, which is the last one in the lineup, X Pro 1, X Pro 2, and X Pro 3. So you can pause the video now if you want to compare all these specs for yourself. There's a lot to discuss. We've also added a USB column all the way at the end, right before the prices. And the prices are all used prices because you can't buy any of these cameras new. I've highlighted two cameras here that I believe are the better value. You'll notice the Roman numeral or number after X-Trans. We have 1, 2, 3, 4. If you were to divide Fuji cameras into generations, you would bundle them according to which generation of X-Trans sensor is being used. Generally speaking, as we go forward in time and the sensor generations increase in number, there are improvements to low light performance, to dynamic range. And you can see from the XE2 to the XE3, we jump from 16 megapixels to 24. The XE3 also has double the maximum burst speed of 14 frames per second, more autofocus points, it has a touch screen, and has 4K 30 FPS video, whereas you're limited to 1080p 60 FPS video on the XE2. The XE3 also features a microphone port. If 4K video is important to you, yeah, you'd go for the XE3. Otherwise, the XE2 is still great value today. The XE3 adds a joystick, which I've highlighted with that red circle, and you'll see that the flash, the pop-up flash, is missing. So they took away the pop-up flash from the XE2 and they gave you a joystick. So Fuji giveth and Fuji taketh away. If I were to go for this style of camera, I'd be choosing it for its portability, maybe for travel, street photography. Video for me wouldn't be an important consideration. I'd probably go with the XE2 to save some money that I would put towards a lens instead. Finally, the SLR style of cameras. The Bayer sensor entry-level XT100 and X200 here at the top left. Then we have the XT10, 20, 30, and XT30 Mark II, also entry-level, but they feature the X-Trans sensor, and they're kind of the little brother to the XT1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, which you probably already know about. We have the XS10 and XS20, which is Fuji's attempt to lure users of DSLRs into the Fuji ecosystem. Next up, we've got the XT single-digit lineup. Now, these two lineups at the bottom are weather sealed. It doesn't mean you can go dancing in a typhoon with it. It just means that they're going to be built to a higher standard than the cameras at the top. Once again, let's compare the specifications. I've also specified whether there's a headphone port. So we have the XT100 and XT200, which are both Bayer sensor, the XT10, XT20, XT30, XT30 Mark II. For a lot of people new to the Fuji ecosystem, they're going to be drawn towards these cameras. They're lower priced, but they still have a lot of great features. We have the XS10 and XS20, which was just released. Then we have the XT1, XT2, XT3, XT4, and XT5, which is the latest one, still available new for $1,700. Then we have the flagship models, the XH1, XH2, and finally the XH2S. Because these cameras are continuing to get updates, it pushes down the price of the older ones, which are still very good performers, especially if you don't need advanced video features. The XT20 is highlighted. I think the XT20 offers enough improvements over the XT10. It has a 24 megapixel sensor, X-Trans 3. You're not getting weather resistance, but you are getting a tilting touchscreen, 4K 30 FPS video, a microphone jack, and phase detect autofocus. I think for the majority of people, the XT20 is that sweet spot. the X-T2 has been highlighted. Now there's nothing wrong with the X-T1. If autofocus speed isn't that important to you, or if you're looking to pick up a Fuji to adapt manual focus lenses, the X-T1 is a great choice. The X-T2, however, is an improvement. You get that additional card slot. You get 4K video. Vast improvements in autofocus coverage and speed. You get that upgraded 24 megapixel X-Trans 3 sensor, in my opinion, making it a no-brainer at $500. It's also marked as weather resistant. So if you're looking for a camera with just more robust construction than the X-T20-30 lineup, the X-T2 is where I would go. Now what if you're deciding between the X-T2 and the X-T3? There are definite improvements in the X-T3. The X-T3 has better autofocus continuous tracking, better autofocus in low light, better video specs. It has USB-C charging, an improved frame rate of 11 frames per second continuous. It uses a new generation of sensor, and it has a higher resolution electronic viewfinder. So that's another one to potentially consider, especially if you see a great deal. And finally, I've highlighted the X-H1, but that first camera in Fuji's flagship line is still a great choice. And while it was expensive when it was new, I think it's a really underrated camera today. In-body image stabilization, you're getting 5 stops of IBIS, you're getting 2 SD card slots, you're getting 4K video, a microphone jack, a nice 24 megapixel X-Trans 3rd generation sensor, and a high resolution EVF. What's not to love? Yeah, it's a bit heavier, it's a bit chunkier, and it eats up batteries, but if you don't mind the additional size and weight, the X-H1 is still a great choice today if you can find one in good condition. Here's a quick comparison between the X-T20 and the X-T2. The most obvious difference is the X-T2 has that dedicated dial for choosing your ISO, so you can truly operate it as if you were shooting a film camera, no menu diving at all. The X-T2 also has a joystick. Now, even though the X-T2 offers more manual controls, the X-T20 is no slouch, and you can see by the dials and buttons available that it is a little powerhouse of a camera. Comparing the X-H1 and the X-T2, you can see the X-H1 has a much deeper grip, and it has that top LCD screen. You can see the X-H1 has that dedicated AEL and AF on buttons at the back, reminiscent of professional flagship DSLRs. Now, there are way too many lenses to talk about, but if you're looking for a great first lens to try in the Fuji lineup, I think if you choose one of these 5, you really can't go wrong. So first, at the top left, we have the 18 to 55 millimeter, one of the best kit lenses ever made for any system. I wouldn't buy this lens new because you can pick it up for less than half the price, $300 used, because it was bundled with a lot of Fuji cameras. It's a great lens to have, very versatile for travel, and especially if you're not sure which prime lens to invest in, you can use this lens to try out a bunch of different focal lengths before committing money towards a prime. Now for your first prime lens, I'd choose either a 23, which is around the 35 millimeter equivalent, or a 35, which is around the 50-55 millimeter equivalent field of view. Most people gravitate to one or the other. The 23 millimeter f2 is a great choice, also around $300 used. I'd personally go for the 35mm f1.4, great rendering, one of the most popular Fuji lenses for a reason. You can pick this guy up for $400 used. Even if you don't have that much money to put towards a lens, you can get the excellent 35mm f2, also gets you weather resistance. You can save even more money and go for the XC 35mm f2. It's the same great optics as the 35mm f2R WR, except you lose a bit in build quality, you lose the weather resistance, but it's a cracking deal at $150 used. Any of the cameras we talked about and any of these lenses would make a great Fuji kit to start. If you have your own opinions, I would love to hear them. And as always, thank you for watching and subscribe for more.